Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You ready to kick us off, Jessica?
I think I am. So we're at 2 o'clock. Should we give people a few seconds, just a few more seconds to settle in, Garrett?
Sure, if you want. Looks like quite a few people have joined already.
Oh,
Welcome to the
wonderful.
program from wherever you're tuning in from, and we'll start in just a bit.
Yeah. Okay, well, we are at 2:01, so let's begin. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's event, Beyond the Headlines, AI and Historical Newspapers, with Dr. Molly Hardy and Greg Leppert. I'm Jessica Chappell, Chief of Digital and Online Services at the Boston Public Library.
And I'm Garrett Nelson, President and Head Curator at the Leventhal Map Education Center at the Boston Public Library.
Today's event is the second in a virtual speaker series hosted by the Leventhal Map Education Center and BPL Digital. This series explores how artificial intelligence technologies intersect with public knowledge, democratic participation, and cultural heritage. We're using these series to bring together scholars, technologists, and practitioners who are working at this intersection of AI, the humanities, and public institutions, and really trying to examine everything from AI's implications for civic life to how computational methods transform research with historical collections. In today's event, we're focusing on historical newspapers, and specifically digitized historical newspapers. Many of you who are attending today may be familiar with sites such as Chronicling America, which provides access to millions of pages of historic American newspapers. Chronicling America is part of the National Digital Newspaper Program, which is a long-term partnership between the National Endowment for the Humanities and Library of Congress to develop a searchable database of U.S. newspapers. Boston Public Library participates in NDNP. Our work with NDNP is part of our larger newspaper digitization program. Newspapers and digitized newspapers are universally popular with patrons and researchers. And that is because they are such rich primary sources for our stories. And this kind of large-scale digitization efforts, such as NDNP, is what makes that research and computational analysis possible. It also makes it complex, which is what we're going to hear much more about over the next hour. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Molly Hardy, who currently serves as the project lead for the Public Data Project at Harvard Law School's Library Innovation Lab. Dr. Hardy is a researcher, a writer, someone who knows this space incredibly well. Her most recent article, The Unfree Press in the Revolutionary Age, or How to Read an 18th Century Newspaper, is forthcoming in the Cambridge History of the American Revolution. I'd also like to introduce Greg Leppert. Greg is the Executive Director of the Institutional Data Initiative at Harvard Law School Library. IDI is a research initiative that works with libraries, universities, and government agencies to publish their collections as high-quality data sets. So we're going to hear first from Dr. Hardy and then from Greg. And after that, we'll have some time for discussion, and then there will be time for audience Q&A. Molly, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all so much for enjoying what I know for many of us is a snow day, taking some time to talk about historical newspapers. I'm really thrilled to be the guest of the Boston Public Library and the Leventhal Map Center, two of my favorite cultural heritage institutions in New England. And I want to especially thank Jessica and Garrett for making this event possible. Okay. What I want to share with you today comes from decades of working with historical newspapers in reading rooms and on library shelves, as well as on microfilm readers and on computer screens. What I have found in this work is that a single feature defines historical newspapers. They are messy. Messy to handle, messy to catalog, messy to read, messy to digitize, messy to OCR, messy to word search, messy to appreciate. Because the majority of historical newspapers were short-lived, because they changed hands and changed titles and publishers, because they were often discarded, because they were used for so many other purposes besides reading, things like wrapping up dead fish, because the archive is vast and varied, the work of preserving and cataloging U.S. newspapers is messy, and the work of researching them comes with its own complications and frustrations. And yet, I would argue, newspapers distinguish themselves because they are so crucial to our understanding of the past, while simultaneously being one of the most difficult sources to preserve and to make accessible. In what follows, I'd like to share what I've learned about historical newspapers that I wish I had known decades ago when I started researching with them, and then, moreover, when I started working on projects to mediate them in digital environments. Rather than gas on with my lessons learned, however, I've created a little true-false quiz for us that we'll do together. You're welcome to sit back and listen, but if you'd like to play along, please either scan this QR code or enter this URL into your web browser. Please note that the QR code will reappear on all of the slides. There are a total of 5 question slides that we'll go over together. And as you get this set up, and I should say too that some of the interactive features are not working right now, so you can still take the quiz, but I'm not sure that the results will show up for us, but that's okay. But anyhow, as you get set up, let me offer one more caveat. I'm going to start with a spoonful of medicine in an effort to clarify definitions, and then I promise we'll move on to the sugar. And so now, without further ado, here is the first question, which you can vote on as either true or false. The categories newspaper, periodicals, and serials pretty much describe the same content. The answer is false. All newspapers and periodicals are serials, but newspaper and periodical are distinctive categories. The distinctions can be distilled down to 3 traits: the content of the material, the frequency with which the material is issued, and finally, physical appearance, including both size and mise en page. I refer you on the slide to an article in which I outline these differences in detail. But to sum it up briefly, a newspaper is a serial publication whose content is defined as current events of general interest. Periodicals focus on current events in general periodicals focus less on current events and general news, so they tend to lack obituaries or news on a variety of topics. And this matters because the distinction organizes much of the world of serial digitization as we know it. So, for example, a large database like Chronicling America contains newspapers, but not periodicals. And much of what users might be surprised not to find there can be explained by this fundamental distinction. Okay, moving on to our next question. True or false? We have a complete list of historical U.S. newspapers published between 1690 to the present, and almost all of them have been digitized. I'll give you a second to think about that. The answer to this is also false. The collecting and listing of U.S. newspapers has never been even. Many efforts at comprehension have been attempted, however. In fact, the history of collecting and listing newspapers is almost as old as the nation itself. Here we see an advertisement from Isaiah Thomas's Massachusetts Spy in 1810, in which he's soliciting copies of newspapers to complete the list he's trying to make, as well as the collection he is starting to preserve in Worcester in what would become the American Antiquarian Society. 2 centuries later, Clarence Brigham and Avis Murray picked up the gauntlet thrown down by Thomas and completed a nearly comprehensive bibliography of American newspapers before 1820. After that, things get iffy. After 1820, the rise of industrial print meant a sharp increase in the number of newspapers. And from this point on, we do not have a comprehensive bibliography or even list of the newspapers produced. We rely instead on directories, most notably Rowell's and Ayers, which were advertising firms who kept lists of newspapers for potential customers. So they didn't mean these to be newspaper lists, comprehensive newspaper lists or bibliographies. They were doing this for another reason, their business. And so it's worth noting that not only do we not know every newspaper that came off the presses in this country, we also have an incomplete collection of those that do survive. The best place to look for the record of both known titles and the location of holdings of papers is the Directory of U.S. Newspapers, a resource jointly produced by the Library of Congress and the National Endowment for the Humanities. In the question and answer, I'd be happy to discuss this valuable resource further, but in the interest of time, let's now move on to the next question in our game. The newspapers that are digitized the newspapers that are digitized accurately depict the ethnic and racial makeup of the US at a given time. This is also false. To understand why, let's take a further look at the largest aggregation of US historical newspapers, Chronicling America. But before we do, I want to stress that the digitization of newspapers depends entirely on the collecting of newspapers, a process that, as I began the talk explaining, started well over 2 centuries ago. Simply put, we cannot digitize that which we do not have. And so, like with most historical archives or collections, the aporia in the digital record reflects and in many ways amplifies the holes, the missing parts in the physical record. Okay, now on to Chronicling America. Established in 2005 and born out of the US Newspaper Project, Chronicling America is supported by the work of partners in 50 states and the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands in 22 languages other than English. It's, of course, served up from the Library of Congress and supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 2022, Chronicling America began to work within the existing grant framework to enhance representation, not only at the state level, but also in the categories of race and ethnicity. The program had prioritized papers of record and of influence, papers of influence and of record, and those that had long runs. The ethnic press, in contrast, is characterized by short runs, by papers that were produced rapidly and briefly because of all sorts of mitigating circumstances. Prioritizing long runs was then inadvertently another way of prioritizing the white press. The next year, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, also known as a NOFO, representation began to look a little different in the selection criteria for newspapers. In the interest of time, I won't go into too many details here, but I want to point out that underrepresented makes its way into the NOFO as a selection criteria for states to prioritize for the first time. And this change reverberates throughout the guidelines so that long runs are no longer prioritized. And this has helped to address the inequalities in racial and ethnic representation in Chronicling America. As the data visualizations now available on the site, on the Library of Congress's site, and are updated regularly, help to make more transparent what Chronicling America does and does not include. I just want to give a huge shout out to all the people at Library of Congress who work so incredibly hard to make the collection as transparent as possible. The question of representation remains a vexed one in most newspaper collections. And I bring this up to caution researchers against thinking that what they are searching on is in any way complete or comprehensive. Okay, but now on to our next question. The copies we see online in places like Chronicling America are digital scans of original newspapers. Is it true or false that the copies we see online in places like Chronicling America are digital scans of original newspapers? This is false. Anyone who has, in their online historical newspaper wanderings, encountered an image like this knows that the answer here has got to be false. It is true that historical newspapers can be tattered and torn, can have stains and foxing, can be printed poorly, but all of these physical attributions of the paper itself are only compounded by the less than direct path by which most of them come to be digitized. Let me take a moment to explain why. Though we seldom research with microfilm readers these days, it is important to remember that the filming process for most newspaper content you encounter online is still created in the same way. Film reels are scanned, newspapers themselves are not photographed. And to understand why, all we have to do is follow the money. Digitizing from microfilm is far cheaper than digitizing from the newspapers themselves. And so newspaper digitizing, whether paid for with taxpayer dollars or done by proprietary databases, will, for most projects, continue this way for the foreseeable future. Okay, one more question before I close. Historical newspapers are text-based sources that keyword searches make easy to research. True or false? Historical newspapers are text-based sources that keyword searches make easy to research. Well, I would say that this is false too. The first reason we know that this cannot be true is because newspapers contain images, so many images, in the forms of cartoons, advertisements, ornamental type, mastheads, visualizations of all sorts. Heroic efforts, such as those by the Library of Congress's Beyond Words and Ben Lee's Newspaper Navigator, have provided seriously important inroads into the searching of newspapers by images, but seldom does a newspaper database at this time include that feature. The other erroneous and often implicit assumption that comes with keyword searching in newspapers is that we use the same words to describe people, places, and events as were used in the past. Instead, we know that language drifts. To access the past in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, a researcher must use the language of the editors, publishers, and writers of those times. A researcher must, therefore, familiarize themselves with the terminology of the period in which they are studying before turning to the keyword search as if it is an oracle waiting to reveal the truths of the past. I will end by simply saying that what I like most about newspaper research is that it is best not done alone. Because of its messiness, its incompleteness, its frustration, it indeed takes a village to effectively navigate historical newspaper collections. And I'm so grateful to the members of my newspaper research community who have taught me so much and have helped me to prepare for today. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll turn it over to Greg now.
Great. Thanks so much, Molly. Greg, we'll turn it over to you. I'll bring your slides up.
Great. Hi, everybody. Greg Leppert here. Let's see. Okay, great. This is working. I'm the Executive Director of the Institutional Data Initiative. Thank you, everybody, for having me. Who are we? What are we? What do we do? What am I even doing here? As mentioned at the top of the hour, we work with knowledge institutions to make collections available primarily as data sets. So you can do some of our work at institutional.org. Probably most noteworthy, we recently released a collection of about a million public domain books that were scanned at Harvard Library as part of the Google Books project. And a big thing that we think about is, best summarized in this graph here, this complex graph. Data is feeding into AI, and AI is feeding into data. And gosh, this could either look like the serpent eating itself, or this could look like a virtuous cycle. It really depends on who is involved in creating it. And we are trying to get involved and make sure that this is a virtuous cycle, and that this is one that actually lifts the work of everybody who's working in knowledge institutions, including libraries and map and education centers. So what I want to convince you of, and I'm going to move really quick because I got to have a bunch of slides and not a lot of time, but I think those are the best talks. Digitizing newspapers, much like trade wars, are good and easy to win, right? We can just shove the newspapers into these new AI models, and out comes all of the structured data that we want. At least this is what some people are leading us to believe in certain technical circles, that you can just, gosh, you've got those page scans, let's just shove them into an AI model and you'll get out exactly what was printed on the day 200 years ago. But actually, that's not true. At least that's not what we're finding to be true. So our team is a bunch of AI researchers, a bunch of people from libraries, all really thinking about the details here. What is the technology good for? What can it do today? What's it going to be able to do tomorrow and 10 years from now? And how can we use it in the service of making sure that when we digitize things, when we do things like OCR, optical character recognition, to make that text that was scanned machine readable, that it's accountable to the original truth, the ground truth, at least of the scan that we have. That's as close as we can get. We tend to, once we get the scan, that's where we start our work. So, why can't you just shove things into an AI model today? Well, actually, there are a lot of complexities in there. Sometimes the models are really good, but they're huge, and it would just be cost prohibitive to do it, or it would have a negative environmental impact. Sometimes it actually becomes hard to audit the results. And other times there are failures that are just insipid in the way that they kind of hide throughout the text. Newspapers in particular are challenging, but we're working with Boston Public Library on a big project right now, a few million newspaper pages that they're in the process of scanning. And we want to do a good job here. And what we really want to do is create a pipeline that is dependable, that can not only be used with Boston Public Library's newspapers, but really any of the newspapers that are out there. If you follow technical circles, which I won't assume that everybody here does, but gosh, let's dig down a little bit, and I'll tell you what you need to know, and that'll give you some context. We've seen a huge influx of OCR models. Again, these AI models that can look at the pixels and infer what the words were supposed to be. And it's amazing. In the last, 6 months, there have been a bunch of these VLMs, visual language models, and they're creating new capabilities where you can do things like read tables out of a scan and reconstruct them into a usable Excel sheet. But what's our focus? Like, how are we going to tackle this? Well, we're standing on the shoulders of some previous work. So Newspaper Navigator was mentioned by Molly. What a great project. This was used by, this was an older model from 2020. This is pre-ChatGPT. And you can see that there's some segmentation done here. It really paved the way for decomposing these complex cultural objects and using them in new ways. And then also American Stories. This was a project at Harvard from 2023 that used a model called YOLO. You only look once is what YOLO stands for. Not, you only live once. You only look once, and then you can figure out how you want to pull things out of these pages. But what are we doing? Well, our hypothesis was that actually, if we deconstruct the page into component parts, then we can get a much better output than if we try and classify those parts before pulling them out. That's what those previous projects did, was they said, oh, let's see if we can identify the ads and the images and the text, and then we'll slice them out, and we'll put them, we'll then try and make them machine readable. What we're doing now is we're slicing them all up, and then we're saying, once we've got these little bits of content, can we classify those? Is that a more tractable way to go about this? And in fact, what we're finding out is that it is. So you can see here's our pipeline. I won't pause. There's no time for this. We've got too many slides. Here's our layout segmentation. This is our live data that we're using with Boston Public Library. We're getting great results. And in fact, the reason we're getting great results is both because of that work that was done previously, but also because of all these advances in AI. So, previously, one of the earlier newspaper projects used YOLO version 8. Now we're up to YOLO version 11. That must be better. It's a bigger number. In fact, it is, but it's not better out of the box. What we had to do was hand label a bunch of these newspapers and draw little bounding boxes around all of the different segments, and then use that as a training set to fine tune this model to work with newspapers. And here you can see just how well it's pulling things out. And so, once we've got that all trained, now we're thinking about, okay, how can we do this OCR, this optical character recognition? Well, now we've got just little bits of content that we can work with. And you can see here, there's a new OCR model called dots.ocr that does an amazing job. I mean, just look at how broken up this text is, and look at what Tesseract, this is previously what the industry standard was, Tesseract OCR. It's doing its darndest, but it's putting some percent signs in there. You can see how it got there, right? The advertiser office, that's kind of percenty, but dots.ocr is doing an amazing job. But in fact, it's doing a little bit too amazing of a job, because if you look at application at, may be found on application at the advertiser office, the typesetter here did not put a space there. This didn't exist in the original one, but dots.ocr has helpfully put it in. Is that helpful to us? Well, actually, it's probably not. If you're a digital humanist who wants to study the evolution of language, you want to know when somebody forgot that space, and maybe somebody else replicated that because they were copying someone else's homework. And that's how language evolves. And we need to be aware of that as we use these tools. So here you can see this is Tesseract, which is trying to digitize this table here. And this is what we get out of dots.ocr. Now this is actually somewhat usable. You can actually go through the hours of this post office and see when they might have been open. So this opens new doors for research. Gosh, I'm gonna blaze through here just to show you one last thing about how good these OCR models are. You can see the Evening Standard, Wednesday, May 24th, 1893. That's at the top here. You can see in black, that's what's been OCR'd. The amusements and entertainment directory, that's that little, you see how that's cut off? You see those little nubbins of text? It correctly OCR'd the first two components of that text, just from that little bit. But then it incorrectly OCR'd some other things that don't exist. You can see those in red, the Crown Windsor gear. That's not true. That's not real. And here you can actually see what was meant to be there. So we have to be really careful how we deploy these. So once we have the crops, we want to classify them. We want to figure out what's an ad, what's an image, so that we can apply different models to them, and we can make sure that we're able to do things like stitch all the content back together into a readable format. And so here you can see our pipeline is that we take these crops and we send them both to an image classifier, which tries to guess based on the pixels what the thing is, and then a text classifier, which just using the text that was recognized in the image, maybe there are things that it says that lead us to believe, oh, that sounds really addy, or that sounds like maybe an obit or something like that. And then we go through and we combine those heuristics, and then we make a final determination. And this is really the work. When I made the joke earlier that AI is it's easy to do and good to win, something to that effect. In fact, what you still need is a multi-pronged approach to get dependable results out of these. And this is the work we're doing. And we're doing this in partnership with BPL. A lot of the feedback that we're getting here about how effective are the technologies we're building. Well, we understand that because we're sending them to the folks at BPL. They're giving us feedback. They're helping us understand how close we're getting, lending their expertise, and then we're working together to come to a final result. So, what are the things left to do? Well, reading order is one of them. We want to make sure that we can take these columns and stitch together all of an article as it spans different columns and eventually different pages. We want to do things like named entity extraction so that we can understand the people that are in this. These are older techniques, but in fact, there are new ways to do them now with the new models. We want to do language detection because, in fact, newspapers, they don't necessarily contain just one language. There were many audiences that were reading these, and sometimes the ads are in a different language than the main newspaper. And then at the end of this, we want to be able to deduplicate some of it, or at least point people to duplication so that we can see how stories travel, or we can facilitate things like AI model training and bring new utility to these collections in addition to the traditional utility for things like research and digital humanities, these sorts of things. So that's the end of my part.
Thanks so much, Greg. Thanks, Molly. Well, let's get into discussion, and I would love to talk about the messiness of newspapers as newspapers, and the messiness of newspapers as data, which I think you both really, thank you, Molly, for setting us up with newspapers are messy. Gosh, they really are. They're messy and they're complex. So, Greg, you mentioned the project that we're doing at BPL with you, and this is, yes, it's millions of pages of digitized newspapers. We're working with you on the OCR segmentation, these other things that you just covered. And we're doing that because for us, it's about creating additional entry points into newspapers as digital objects. We really want to give people more ways to discover, access, and use these rich historical records. But we also plan to create a data set and to release that data set. And I think, you brought up some of these big promises that people are making about newspapers and AI and what can be done. And I think it's very tempting for us to look at newspapers and newspapers data sets and imagine all that they could be used for, and to kind of imagine them as sort of like this just rich source. They're abundant, they're digitized at scale, they capture the texture of daily life. But they are also deeply problematic as representations of truth or historical reality. And that's because everything in a newspaper is constructed. And if you look at late 19th century, early 20th century papers, these were things that were constructed multiple times a day. There wasn't just a morning edition or an evening edition. There might also be an afternoon edition. So they really, they don't reflect what happened, but the interest and perceptions of what was happening. So when we create these kinds of data sets from newspapers with their various promises, with the things they potentially can tell us, and we make those data sets available for a range of uses, including potentially training data. Like Greg, you and I have talked about that a little, and I know that other institutions are exploring the space as well. How do we grapple with this question of messiness and this issue of sort of like the potential harms or the other sort of hazards of putting out this kind of data set for this kind of use?
Yeah, I'm glad you started with a small question.
Sure.
Ease our way in. That's fine. I think just to start, one of the things that I want to see is knowledge institutions play a critical role in providing data for AI training. And why do I want to see that? Now, first of all, I don't claim to represent the totality of this perspective. I think there are probably other people on this call that have other perspectives, and it's important that all of those are listened to as well. So I don't claim to have arrived at the answer. But what I will say is that there's a lot of information that's being sucked into these models without any context. And what I think the best thing to do is to build a relationship between knowledge institutions and the model makers so that they're actually coming to the knowledge institutions, much like anyone would come to a librarian and ask for guidance about navigating a knowledge collection. Let's build that relationship, and let's make sure that that's something that feels natural 10 years from now, that people that are building models, they come to a museum, they come to a gallery or a library, and they ask those questions. Let's make sure that when we publish data sets, that we publish the context around them. That's one of the things that we did with our books data set, was that we flagged that there was problematic material in there. But I'll also tell you that there is, you could call it a catch-22, where it's that virtuous cycle that I mentioned. Why do many of these OCR models work so well when you feed them corporate documents, for instance? You feed those in and you're like, gosh, wow, this is great. You feed a newspaper in and it's kind of a sad trombone. Well, it's because of the availability of data. And so if you want these tools to work better for newspapers, you need to publish newspaper data for them to be trained on. You need to get into that ecosystem. And we think a lot about as well, both the need for guardrails, but also when we work on, we have the Nuremberg project at Harvard. Harvard Law School Library has this big collection of digitized documents from the Nuremberg trials. And if you apply some of the standardized tools to that, it actually goes off the rails in ways that are unhelpful to digitizing that collection, because it's been tuned out some of the problematic things. But in fact, some of the problematic things are real life things that happen, that if you're somebody trying to make those collections more accessible, in fact, you want to have the best tools available. You don't want to, we don't want to say that, oh, we can't understand Nuremberg because that has to be all done, by hand by one person in the bowels of Harvard Law School Library. Now, there's a spectrum there. And obviously, I've flagged ways in which, this can go off the rails in other ways. But I do think we have to grapple with that. What we're talking about is not just data, it's also utility and interface to the collections. And it's a whole mess of things. And in fact, we may want to have separate models that are trained with collections where they're expert people that are really mindful. And do we want to make those models widely available? Or do we want to make them only available to researchers who are doing projects like Nuremberg? And we feel that we can trust that the rough edges there are actually because it's appropriate to the topic matter, rather than someone trying to inject that into broader society.
Thank you. Molly, I think you and I have had a couple of conversations on this topic.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything more to add. Greg said a lot, and I think that I am not in a position where I'm creating data for AI consumption of historical data, so I don't feel like I necessarily have a perspective that's helpful. So,
but what about the perspective of newspapers as for research and the what can come up in them in terms of the historical evidence, maintaining the value of that, but how those perhaps can be used in a way that I am thinking there a recent project I came across in which somebody had put together data sets they were calling historical LLMs, and essentially they were time locked. They were cut off at a certain time, and they put them out with very clear guidance for researchers, right? Like, this is data from a very specific time. You have to handle these very carefully. Like, this is the purposes, right, essentially. And so I guess I'm kind of asked, are those kinds of guardrails effective? Is it responsible to put out data sets with just those kinds of guardrails and then trust people?
Well, we know, years of user interface research with, much more direct things like keyword searching indicates that people do not read context state documents. And I can imagine that the speed and voraciousness with which AI makes huge data sets available will only aggravate that problem. So I'm not quite, from a technical perspective, I don't know how that could work, but certainly from a UX perspective, a user interface perspective, we know that it doesn't work, that people don't take. So newspapers were created in as a medium not to be, to be digested and to be consumed in a much different time and space scale. And so I'm not quite sure how that transfers to a consumption, a level of consumption that is so much more, that is so heightened. And I think putting, you know, an about page on a set of data, you know, is not necessarily gonna solve that problem. But, you know, also to say that, like, because if you're dealing with a huge newspaper collection, you know, part of what I was trying to show in my talk is how varied that collection is and how nuanced it is, even to be able to keyword search it. There's a lot of usually research that needs to be done. So I'm not quite sure what happens when it all is amalgamated into one data set, and looked to as a kind of, you know, look to with a sort of like Oracle-like ability to offer insight. But we'll see.
I want to, if I can ask a question that actually picks up, I think, on a theme from our last program in this series, which is the tension between providing democratic access, opening doors, and then creating like accidental bad shortcuts, right? Creating cheats or lazy ways of thinking. In the last episode, I guess, in this series, we were thinking about access to like mechanisms of the state and public action, right? Like suddenly many people can comment on a public proposal, and that information could be aggregated in ways that were impossible when you had to come to a public meeting. But then on the other hand, you get these like, you know, problematic summaries or, you know, problematic enclosures of data. I'm curious how that might apply to the work of historical scholarship, right? Greg, you just gave the example of, you know, you don't have to go to, you know, spend hundreds or thousands of hours in a physical library to do research on a very niche subject. That is democratizing. It opens up access. Lots of people can do the work that used to be only done by professional historians. But then, you know, we run the real risk of when you do historical research in that way, do you actually have the context, the nuance, the understanding to make it meaningful? And so I'm curious, just as technologists, as librarians, as folks who work on public-facing research institutions, Jessica and I, of course, are also in a public research institution, and trying to engage with researchers from all walks of life, some of whom have 30 minutes to do a research project, some of whom have 20 years to do a research project. How do we take these tools and, you know, kind of meet people at the right spot, right? So that we are empowering people, we are democratizing access, but not accidentally creating these sloppy or, you know, cheap sort of almost ersatz ways of not knowing.
I think that one thing that I was trying to show is the amount of work that still is to be done at a very rudimentary level with historical newspapers. So like we don't even know what they are. Like, you know, like we don't have a basic bibliography of them. And that's astounding, right? And it's because it's really hard, but it's not impossible at all. And especially with all of the technological availabilities, you know, that we have, that Clarence Brigham and Avis Murray didn't have, that Isaiah Thomas didn't have in 1810. But we haven't done that, right? And so that U.S. newspaper directory that the Library of Congress and puts out, and that the NEH supported for decades, is our best step. But even that needs a great deal of improvement. And so that kind of just very basic work, I think, is actually the best way to democratize access. But unfortunately, it's work that's very hard to fund because it's not sexy, and it's not, you know, it's not. It would and could benefit, and there's some really amazing someone like Dan Evans doing amazing research to make that kind of level of bibliographical detail. Sort of trying to think about how we can bring new tools to that. But unfortunately, you know, you say bibliography and you say data, and one gets funding and one doesn't. So.
I would to just plus one on what Molly had to say. This may be a cold consolation, but I do think that because of some of the challenges that Molly flagged, a lot of the risks here will actually sit downstream of their manifestation in other areas. And so, you know, it may be current and present news on social platforms that actually are a sign of some of the things that maybe the research community could tackle ahead of time. And so in some ways, the present disinterest in these collections means that there will be a little bit more time to reason about what the effects of AI will be, because It was, gosh, it was 18 months ago when a lot of the model makers were going out and looking for as many EPUBs as they could find. You're looking for the EPUBs first, and eventually you get to the micro format newspapers, but you didn't start there. And so you get to see the effects that that's had for authorship in those realms and for hallucination in those realms and whatnot. And so I think that there's a real role for, you'll see in companies right now, there's like a chief AI person whose job is to figure out how AI might impact the processes within that company. Right. So, gosh, we do these 10 different things. My job is to just think about how AI might automate those. Now, setting aside all of the labor implications of those, which are not small, but also are not the topic of this conversation, you could imagine that there could be someone at a prominent institution whose job is to observe how things are playing out in these other realms as canaries for the research fields that we care about here, and then help us stay one beat ahead and learn from their mistakes. Maybe we've got 18 months of lead time. Maybe we've only got 6 months of lead time, but at least we've got some lead time, and we're not the ones who are necessarily making the first mistakes. And no doubt we will have our own first mistake, but I think fortunately we'll also have some time probably to correct it, simply because this stuff is still largely inaccessible and the scales are yet to come.
We've got to outrun the the biggest challenges. Jessica, do you have any more questions? We've got some coming in from the audience, so we can turn to audience questions.
Yeah, why don't we turn to some audience questions, particularly because I think Greg and Molly, you touched a little bit on labor, and labor is not inconsequential. It's a big part of what we do, and the difficulty of even understanding what the newspapers are, what we've digitized, how to get more digitized, the funding question that is huge. But yeah, let's go to the audience questions.
Great. We'll pull up some questions from the audience. As a reminder, if you're on Facebook or YouTube, you can write in with a comment at any time. We'll try to get to as many as we can before the end of the hour. And I also want to emphasize, no matter what background you're coming from, we welcome your questions. Whether you are have been working on AI or historic newspapers for decades, or whether this is your first time thinking about the topic, we want to know what you think, and we want to know how to continue this conversation. So we'll start. We'll start with Isabel Lipton with a question saying, so cool and valuable. When you identify projects, how does your team assess ahead of time what is worthwhile, especially regarding environmental impact? What considerations do you use?
Oh, great. I assume that was directed at me. So, gosh, how do we think about it? We think broadly about impact. We're at the beginnings of our initiative. So in some ways, we're still building relationships, and the opportunity that we have are defined by the relationships that we can create. But let's talk about a scenario in which we've really built all of the relationships that we need, and we have any choice of project that we can work on. We have a scale that we think about, which includes things like, what is the scale of the collection that we might be able to work on? What is the cultural impact that it could have, including for marginalized communities? And that is awesome. Also, sometimes marginalized within AI, is that community going to get left behind in terms of reaping the benefits of AI or being able to interact with AI from a language perspective? So that's how we prioritize there. When we think about, in some ways, it's helpful that we ourselves are a bit constrained from a compute perspective. So we have to think creatively about how to get the job done that we want to do. Now, we do have some partnerships where we could run, one project at a massive scale with compute on one of the major model makers. And that would be a one-off project. But gosh, that wouldn't be a lot of fun to say that, gosh, we got maybe 1 million newspaper pages done. Good luck to the rest of you. Try and build your partnerships and get a bunch of compute credits. That's not useful. And so I think all that to say, there is some good, for lack of a better term, synergy between being efficient and mindful from an environmental perspective, and also the scale of impact that you might have. And so we're often looking at, can we take things that are really expensive or costly, maybe is the better way of saying it, costly either from a financial perspective or from an environmental perspective, and use those as a subset. So when we talk about classifying crops, when we did the outlining of the different segments of the newspaper, we did all that by hand. But once we had those crops, we wanted to classify them, whether they're ads or photos or whatever. we were able to take one of those expensive visual language models and do the classification of those, because it's highly accurate, but resource intensive, then take that as a training set for these very small models that you could run on a laptop. In fact, we run them on laptops as test sets to distill that down. And so now that you can think about it as taking like a very small slice of functionality from this VLM and manifesting it in a highly efficient environment. And that's better for us as people working day to day. It's better for the environment. It's better for the libraries who we're trying to build repeatable tools that they might be able to use themselves. So, sorry, the short answer is align incentives. Like make sure all of your incentives are aligned. And in fact, if you think robustly about them, there are probably a lot more incentives that are at play. And if you internalize those, then you'll make better decisions that are better for the environment and for everybody.
Yeah, and certainly I'll echo at the BPL and the Leventhal Center, kind of working backwards from what's going to make sense for impact for users, right? And then thinking through the entire pipeline of resources, both compute resources, financial, time, staff resources, and how does that fit into a broader ecosystem, both of preserving collections, making them accessible, and then making them finally useful to end users. Molly, did you want to jump in on that question at all about
I guess just two things I would ask or mention. It brings to my mind, like, how could all of the bounding work that is creating bounding boxes around newspapers, which has been done for every single page that you see in Chronicling America. So, millions and millions of pages. Could that also be used, or, in what ways? Not that we need to get into the technical, but I'm just curious as to like why it has to be redone. And then the other thing is, I'm curious about just the difference between when you are dealing with images of newspapers that come from physical newspapers, which you all are, and then of course when the vast majority of newspaper digitization is from microfilm, how and if these processes can or cannot be used on a grand scale with images that have a different source. So those are just the questions that come to mind, but I think it's more important to get into other audience questions. We don't have to get into the details.
Another question is from Elizabeth Peterson, who asks if you can comment on AI bots scraping content from open newspaper repositories into LLMs and then monetizing that content into commercial AI tools.
I feel like I answered the lot. I don't know, Molly, if you want to have a perspective, and then I'll. No, okay, you don't want to have a perspective. That's fine. How do I think about this? I think that the information ecosystem is in for a shakeup, and it's complicated. And I think that what we've depended on as a basis for the ideas of open information and knowledge are about to get reevaluated. And that, I think, can be scary, but it can also be an opportunity. So if you look at platforms like Wikipedia, for instance, gosh, what a shining success, I think, in terms of a manifestation of the promise of the internet. And it's been open, and yet I think they're facing a moment where, what happens when all that information is in a model. And that model can, let's say it can with 100% accuracy answer the question based on Wikimedia or Wikipedia data, but then nobody ever goes to Wikipedia. And now nobody's becoming an editor of Wikipedia. Nobody's refining that. That's a broken deal of sorts. The deal used to be, I'm going to index your website. I'm Google. I'm going to index Wikimedia, and I'll send people there, and they'll read the article, and then they'll be like, oh, that's wrong. Somebody's wrong on the internet. I better become an editor on Wikimedia, and then the community grows. When that breaks down, now you have to reevaluate everything. And I think that the same thing is happening with open data here. And it's likely that the era of Wikipedia the way it is today, and Creative Commons the way it is today, and a lot of these other initiatives may not fully represent what the future will be, but I am optimistic that the future that we're going into could be equally beneficial, if not more, for surfacing information and making it accessible and democratizing access. But we're going to have to think differently about how we do that.
And it's certainly a consideration for those of us who run open data infrastructure, both in terms of the technical aspect of making sure that those don't get brought down by bot access. But again, balancing like who are we generating this information for? I love the way you describe it as an information ecosystem. And of course, libraries and data repositories are a huge player in that ecosystem. Let's see. Here's another question from JBC asking, instead of pushing all of the newspaper content into an AI training set, what if the AI is trained to use a conventional index that was created for search by humans? Maybe this ties in, Molly, to some of your notes about bibliography and indexing of newspaper collections.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Garrett, can you put the question back?
Sure, of course.
That second part, AI is trying to use a conventional index. So a conventional index of what? Of newspaper? I'm just not quite, I'm sorry, the question's sort of confusing me and I want to give a helpful answer, but.
I can take a very short swing that maybe will contextualize.
Sure.
Molly, when I was still at the Library Innovation Lab, so I was previously at the Library Innovation Lab, and it's one in, one out there. So when I left, Molly came in, and there was equilibrium in the world. But we were talking about, could we train a model on the search syntax for Hollis, which is the Harvard search system for libraries, because there are a lot of great search operators there, which if you've ever, if you grew up trying to search eBay for, vintage records, then you know a lot about search operators, but you probably know more than most people do. And it's the same thing for Hollis. So can you train a model to actually, you say, hey, I want to search for certain things in Hollis, and then it would translate those into search operators and run the search in Hollis, and then Hollis would return the results, and there'd just be a compatibility layer. And absolutely, you can do that. People are building systems like that all the time, and I think there's plenty of opportunity. But Molly would, I think, have more robust thoughts as somebody who thinks a lot about user experience.
Well, if we're talking about citation indices, I guess it depends what your question is about from the newspaper set. I can think of any number of examples in which data is fed in to generate a response, including a library catalog. But I think that yes, I think that the use of indices to ask questions back of the data will be useful. Especially, I would encourage that kind of thinking for the name entity recognition work. There's a lot of name entity work that has been done with the title essays, which are short, sort of almost like newspaper biographies of almost every title, soon to be every title in chronicling America, and there's been data pooled of name entity recognition work done in those, that then I think it would be really beneficial to feed back into the newspapers so that you can get a kind of reliability. That, of course, gets checked against LCNAF. And so that's, the Library of Congress National Name Authority files. And so then that becomes a really helpful way of also surfacing names and editors from the ethnic press who may not actually have already been recognized as having name authority status in the Library of Congress system. I can refer to some of the work that Joshua Ortiz-Baca was doing on that about 5 years ago. So yeah, I think if that's the kind of indices we're talking about, I think there's a lot of potential there.
There's also, if I can just riff off of that too, there's so much potential with kind of unstructured, structured data, right? Data that was originally presented in a structured form, whether it was stock market reports, or for us, city directories are a very common type of imaged material that we want to reform into structured data, and using different classification pipelines to restructure that structured data. I know many periodicals had indices of their own that were published contemporaneously to their original publication. So thinking about unpacking or restructuring that structured data from original sources rather than just throwing text and prose and images at the model, I think can have some interesting potential inputs as well.
Yeah, I think too, it raises a lot of questions too, like newspaper catalog records, which we haven't talked a lot about, but really are kind of the keys to the kingdom here, right? Yeah. And they tend, not always, but they tend to be pretty sparse. And so thinking about the ways in which that which is the structured data of the catalog can inform that which we do with the data, and then vice versa, I think is really exciting potential. Keeping in mind, of course, that a catalog record maybe shouldn't do everything all the time. But that sort of interplay is certainly has all the potential in the world for newspapers.
Jessica, do you want to pick up one last question before we wrap the program at the top of the hour?
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more. And why don't we talk very quickly about the funding situation of the national project, the NDNP project, considering the NEH, and I think many people here know about what happened. Was that in April 2025, early in the Trump presidency, when DOGE came in and slashed IMLS, NEH, and NIH, and a number of other federal programs. Apparently that funding has been restored. So BPL right now, we are now working with round 3 of the NDNP, and I know that funding for round 4, NEH recently opened that up. So it seems that the program is continuing. And Molly, I know we haven't touched on what you did before Library Innovation Lab, but you have some insights because of your long time with the NEH.
I do. I have to be careful here because I don't want to, either present, things that I know from the government because of my previous role there. But yeah, I did work for the National Endowment for the Humanities in the Division of Preservation and Access. I'm very happy to follow along with your observations, Jess, that funding continues for the National Digital Newspaper Program to produce Chronicling America in close partnership with the Library of Congress. So I know, so what I know is pretty much what all of us here know from just looking and seeing, which grant funding opportunities are still being put out by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the fact that they just released opportunity for a new round of funding is certainly a sign that this work will continue. I will make one very sort of generic, if you will, observation, which is to say that one of the many great things about newspapers is that they're sort of everything to everyone, which is to say that their content, where they came from, they're so capacious, again, back to the messiness of them. And so, just to say that there's something for everybody in large newspaper aggregation sets. And so I am optimistic, not without worry, but I'm cautiously optimistic that that this work will be able to continue, because to say that newspapers are partisan is just not, that's just simply not true, right? And so it sort of warms my heart that that I think this work is continuing, and I hope it will be able to continue.
Ollie, that is a wonderful note for us to end on today. Thank you. Newspapers, they are for everyone. Thank you, Greg. Thank you both for being here, for sharing your work and insights with us today. I want to thank everybody. I think Garrett and I would like to thank everybody who joined us today. Thank you all for being here. A recording of today's event will be available, I think, shortly online. Garrett?
Yep. If you registered for the event, you'll get a follow-up note with a link to the broadcast. Also, if you're watching on YouTube right now, it's the same link that you're at right now. It'll also be embedded in the Leventhal Center's website for this program listing.
Great. Well, join us again on Monday, March 2nd at 2 p.m. ET or Eastern Time. We'll be exploring photograph collections at scale, so the intersection of AI and photograph collections. There'll be much more information about that event soon. We'll be sharing a link. You can stay connected and find more info at bpl.org/events or visit the leventhalmap.org website. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Molly.
Thanks, Garrett. Thanks, Jessica.
Take care, everyone.